All right. So we're going to kick off our second hour now after we've done a hands-on game experience called the Brain Architecture Game. It's a tool for understanding adverse childhood experiences. And we're so looking forward now to this hour where our very well-known presenter will talk a lot more about this for all of us to glean from, whether we're in person or online. So let me introduce our expert. Dr. Amanda Zelahusky is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist and an attorney specializing in trauma. She is a professor of psychology and the director of clinical training at Purdue University Northwest. Are you still Boilermakers in the North? The Pride. Okay. I grew up in Indiana, and that's where Purdue is. So she is also board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology. As director of the Psychology, Law, and Trauma Lab, her research examines the intersection between psychology, law, and trauma, particularly for underserved populations. Most recently, she conducted research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on children and parents, which led to the creation of Pandemic Parenting, a free digital resource hub and nonprofit organization. In addition to her roles at Purdue Northwest, Dr. Zelahusky provides training and consultation to mental health, education, and legal agencies. Her teaching, research, and community outreach efforts have won numerous awards, and her work has been featured in most major news and media outlets, including ABC News, CNN, NBCLX, The Washington Post, The New York Times, AP News, Parents, National Geographic, WebMD, and Vice. Please help welcome Dr. Zelahusky.
Thank you. All right. Well, hi again to everybody in the room. And hi to everybody online. So for those of you online, we just finished doing a really fun activity called the Brain Architecture Game. So I just wanted to put up that website and resource again. For those of you tuning in virtually, might want to learn more about it. You can go to the website. There's some videos that kind of show what we just completed together in the room. So thank you again for having me. And I am very excited to talk to you about something I'm deeply passionate about, have been studying and practicing for many years, as you heard. Probably one of the questions I know I'll get is how do we access this information? So if you want the slides, I'll put the QR code up now for just a second, and then I'll be sure to put it up again at the end so that you can download them. I've packed them full of resources that I'm hoping are helpful for your organizations and your work and yourselves. And so please feel free to download them if you would like. I'll leave it up there for just one more second. Plus, it makes me feel very like tech savvy and cool. You know, like, oh, scan the code. All right, I'll put it up again at the end, I promise. Okay, so the topic, how trauma impacts, you know, and it's a bit of a play on words on purpose, right? Of course, we're going to talk about how it impacts youth, but there's no way that when we do this work and move in these spaces that we are not impacted as well. And maybe many of us in the room have experienced trauma ourselves, adverse childhood experiences ourselves. And so sometimes that's a reason we're drawn to this work and to these spaces. So why are we talking about this now, right? Why trauma? Why this timing? So if I just sort of think about the context before the pandemic, right? This was a major public health issue. These are just some of sort of the headlines and major white papers and things coming out that trauma is a public health issue. We should be thinking about it as a public health crisis, and we really weren't or hadn't been to that point. And what does it look like to take more of a public health approach to trauma? So we just had a lot of pioneers in our field really shouting out these calls to action that like, we need to think about this as a public health issue. Should we be treating things like childhood trauma in the same way we do other public health crises? So here is a quote from one of my favorite pioneers in this field. You're going to hear from him a couple of times today. I'm going to mention his name several times, which is Dr. Bruce Perry. Anybody familiar with his work? Fantastic. Yep, I'm a big fan too. So if 20 million people were infected by a virus that caused anxiety, impulsivity, aggression, sleep problems, depression, respiratory and heart problems, vulnerability to substance abuse, antisocial and criminal behavior, intellectual disability, and school failure, we would consider it an urgent public health crisis. And yet, in the US alone, there are more than 20 million abused, neglected, and traumatized children vulnerable to these problems. Our society has yet to recognize this epidemic, let alone develop an immunization strategy. So this was an issue before. And then we throw in a global pandemic into the mix, right? Do you think that exacerbated things? Sure did. Here are just some of the headlines that, caught my eye, even in the early days of the pandemic, right? Students are falling behind, struggling with mental health. We've seen those issues go up in significant ways. The isolation, teens feeling suffocated in that isolation, struggling to balance then all of the new challenges in their lives. So the COVID-19 pandemic really exacerbated what we already knew was an issue, but in some ways I feel like made us start to look at it with that public health lens. And so I am grateful for that, though I could have done without a global pandemic for sure. So these are some of the things I just want to highlight today, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what is trauma, different trauma types, what are ACEs, what's the impact of childhood trauma, and what does a trauma-informed resiliency building community look like? And I'm going to bring in, my favorite part about doing some of these presentations is you're going to see examples from some of the digital sort of knowledge translation work I've been doing. And so I'm bringing in a lot of my friends. You're going to hear from other experts today through videos and other resources, because I'd like you to hear from a lot more voices than just mine in this work. So when we talk about defining trauma, what is it? This is the definition we get from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, comes from the first criterion in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder: exposure to one or more events that involve death or threaten death, actual or threatened serious injury, or threatened sexual violation. So that's the definition. And then it goes on to talk about ways you might have been exposed to these things, okay, by witnessing it, experiencing it directly, and so on. Does that capture everything? So what's an example of, say, an early adverse experience that definition is not going to capture? What's that? Going hungry, right. What else? Divorce, parenting, right? Divorce is an interesting one. People will ask me about that a lot. Like, is that considered a trauma? Well, it depends. Like many of these things we're going to talk about, it depends. For some kids, it's a relief. My parents are both happier. They're in separate places now. I have stability, calm. For other people, absolutely it is. It means displacement. It means I have to move to a new community, a new school. My parents are still fighting. So a lot of these situations could potentially be traumatic, but it depends on the impact. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Emotional neglect is another one that to me really isn't in here. And wow, is that the foundation of a lot of the challenges we see, right? Is somebody, or psychological abuse, for example, right? If somebody's telling you every day, you're never going to be good, you're just like your father, you're going to amount to nothing, that traumatic? Potentially. And certainly this definition wouldn't capture it. So I raise that to just point out that, there's a lot of subjectivity to this. Events, as Dr. Shalev says, are never traumatic just because they meet a threshold criterion. These are individual or collective, as we'll talk about, experiences that aren't just about what the event was, but how somebody was impacted by them. So these are some of the major trauma types, right? The common ones you're probably used to sort of seeing, hearing about, talking about, a lot of the usual suspects, if you will. But I want to break these down a little bit more and classify them into the ways we talk about different types of trauma exposures into acute, chronic, and complex. So acute trauma is going to be your single traumatic event, like a car accident, right? Or a natural disaster, something that's limited in time that somebody experiences once. Chronic trauma can mean one of two things. It can mean a series of those isolated events, but you're experiencing them sort of in a sequence over a period of time. Or it can mean it's pervasive and lasting, like chronic neglect or chronic abuse, right? Throughout many years of childhood. How many of you are familiar with the term developmental or complex trauma? Okay, a handful of you. So this is one not as commonly understood. So what we mean about developmental trauma, or as it starts to be talked about more as people get older, as complex trauma, is it's the traumatic sort of exposure, say abuse, something like that, that's happening within a caregiving system, within a relationship. So the person that is there to protect you and nurture you is in fact the one inflicting harm. And that makes it a lot more complicated, right? In terms of how we start to develop relationships, build attachments. So it's this idea that, it can interfere with the individual's ability to form relationships. It's just really pervasive across a lot of areas of development. And then the reaction to it is quite complex. The way we encounter the world then after developmental trauma can look different than other things like, say, the more classic PTSD we talk about, which again was a diagnosis intended for combat veterans. It was never meant to capture these early developmental experiences in the way that we now often use it in our diagnostic system, imperfectly, of course. So those are common classifications: acute, chronic, and complex. But then we go a little bit deeper and start to talk about some of these other trauma types that we are increasingly understanding more about in the research and in clinical practice. So I already talked about developmental and complex trauma. Collective trauma, right? Let's talk about that for a second. This is when trauma reaches a level where it negatively impacts entire societies or groups of people. War, mass violence, genocide. Anybody think of a more recent example, maybe? How about that, right? How about the COVID-19 pandemic? Was a collective trauma in many ways for us as a society on multiple levels and globally. And certainly different areas were impacted in different ways. So the other piece I just want to say about collective trauma, a lot of you are in helper roles, right? Are you in mental health, social services, providing lots of support, first responders? We were going through that collective trauma experience at the same time as many of the people we were trying to help. And that was really unique. Like, I talked to so many mental health professionals who are like, I am going through the exact same thing as all of my clients, and I've never been in that situation before, right? In real time, right now, I'm trying to support them with the thing I'm struggling with too. So I also think about that under this umbrella of collective trauma. And another piece related to that is this idea that, we're not all in the same boat. So the writer Damien Barr commented this early in the pandemic. We're not all in the same boat. We are all in the same storm. Some of us are on super yachts and some have just the one oar. And this is why we saw such differential impact of something like the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because people had different resources, different layers of privilege, had access to different things. For some people, it wasn't that bad, they described. For others, it was horrific. And so we have to sort of think about then, what are the contextual pieces that make an experience like that worse, for some segments of society and some groups. So I want to introduce you to a couple of these other areas of trauma in case you're not familiar. And one is the what's known as historical trauma. So these are events that are so widespread as to affect an entire culture and even be passed down to influence future generations in that culture, right? In their DNA, genetically, right? We have a lot of research now that helps us understand what some of these historical experiences have meant through multiple generations of a family, of an area, of a region. So I'm going to leave it to some of the experts in this field to explain this to you a little bit better and give you some examples.
Cumulative emotional wounding over and across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events. These are events that don't just target an individual, but they target a whole collective community. Things like forced relocation from traditional homelands, like the Trail of Tears, like my ancestors went through. But the process that our communities talk a lot about is that the trauma is held personally and can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who have not had a direct experience of the trauma itself can feel the effects of that event generations later.
Does historical trauma only affect certain groups of people?
What really helps me to help people understand the notion of historical trauma is that it's actually a phenomenon that lots of communities, indigenous communities, or people all over the world have sort of struggled with. It's not something that specifically is only owned by tribal people or indigenous people. It gets articulated all over the world.
Historical trauma is widespread, affecting many communities across the globe.
Observation has, from the empirical side, started with work on the Holocaust survivors. And there's a lot of work on intergenerational transmission of trauma. And it's moved into also looking at Japanese internment survivors, Armenian survivors, descendants of their Holocaust, and so forth. So there's been some more empirical work in this area. And you can imagine trying to track trauma over generations and trying to tease out what is the impact over generations on this child, combined with whatever traumatic events they've gone through in their childhood and in their lifetime.
Historical trauma is passed on across generations.
I say to you, acknowledgement is due my grandfather, Pop. He never told us the stories of why he did certain things. He never shared with us why he never cried, for example. He never shared with us why he walked out the door when my grandmother cried. Why he turned his back when she cried. Of course we thought he turned his back because he didn't care, of course. But he turned his back, as I look back now, because the pain has no words. I still have the images of him dealing with the limitations that he was up against. I can only imagine the pain. But what I do know is that it didn't go away. It came inside, into those of us who followed him.
No one ever talks about the moment you found out that you were white, or the moment you found out that you were black. That's a profound revelation. The minute you find that out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything, and that's a profound psychological moment.
I saw a water fountain that said white in color. My family was 7 kids by then. We drank a lot of Kool-Aid. So colored water, that was in my cognitive schema. So I go toward this colored water fountain. And while I'm there, just before I get there, there's a little white girl who saw that same colored water fountain, and she was just about to turn the sprocket when her mother came and grabbed her by the arm. And she said, "You cannot drink from that colored water fountain." And she said, "But I want the colored water! I want the colored water! Oh, I want the colored water!" So I knew it must be good. So I run to the colored water fountain, looking for my mom, making sure she won't stop me from drinking. And I turned the water fountain, and it was clear, just like at home. That day, that trauma, I remember to this moment.
For African American communities, historical identity and understanding is inextricably tied to the reality of enslavement.
It ties us to enslavement with what an awful terror, 400 years of trauma we experienced. And for us, we talk about it as being utter cultural erasure.
Before to extend a little bit of what they talked about to touch on racial trauma, which is defined as psychological symptoms like anxiety, hypervigilance to threat, lack of hopefulness for your future as a result of repeated exposure to racism or discrimination. And just to kind of put this in context, one statistic is that Black youth experience an average of 5 incidents of racial aggression or discrimination per day. And I think this framing of death by 1,000 cuts is a good one, right? When we start to talk about things like microaggressions and racial trauma that people experience day in and day out. If we go back to kids for a second, there are situations that can be particularly traumatic for youth that we don't always think about as adults, right? So life-threatening illness or extended illness of a caregiver, worried about like, is somebody going to be here to take care of me? Is my parents safe? Seeing a parent arrested, in front of them. There are lots of different examples. Bullying is another one, right? That can be extremely traumatic for some kids, whereas for others, not as much. So things that are specific for kids that maybe as adults wouldn't necessarily have the same impact, but are important for us to keep in mind. What are things that threaten the safety and security of their lives and their kind of worldviews? So it brings me to ACEs, which again, how many of you are familiar with ACEs? Probably most of you at this point. Okay, great. So it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a group of 10 specific adverse childhood experiences that were asked about in the original study. So you're going to hear now from the study authors of the original ACE study done in the late 90s to give you some context for the kind of ACEs movement. And then I'll talk a little bit more about it.
Rob and Vince then began a collaboration that's ultimately become one of the foremost epidemiologic studies of the long-term health impacts of child abuse and neglect.
I think the most important thing that contributes to the information of the ACE study is simply the powerful nature of when people tell you the truth about their lives and you listen, you understand their life course.
it's made me realize how much of what we see in adult medicine is the result of what was present but not seen in pediatrics.
ACEs changed the landscape, and I want to talk a little bit about how and why they changed the landscape and how we can take what we've learned from the ACEs.
It's just not a social worker's problem. It's just not a psychologist's problem. It's not a pediatrician's problem. It's not a juvenile court judge's problem. It's everybody's.
It changed the landscape because of the pervasiveness of the ACEs, the huge number of public health problems, expensive public health problems, depression, substance abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, cancer, heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes.
As the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of chronic, self-acknowledged chronic depression goes up, so that at ACE score 4 or higher, you're bumping a prevalence of 60%, 60% in women, and about 35% in men.
This is the percentage of people that ever smoked cigarettes, and here's the percentage of current smokers. You know, we could switch the titles on these slides now. You wouldn't know which was from the Kaiser Health Plan and which was a general population sample in Washington.
So how do those people, without the conventional risk factors, end up with coronary disease? We have used this over an 8-year period with 440,000 adult patients.
I believe that this is the most important thing you can ever do, which is begin to deal with this intergenerational transmission of adversity that causes so many problems in our society.
So the main finding, like there were many findings from the study, but one of the most surprising ones that, like they said, sort of changed the landscape of how we understand the impacts of trauma is this, that early childhood adverse experiences led to things like earlier death, mortality, disease, right? Higher incidences of things like heart disease, stroke, cancer. It had this impact on us on a cellular level, which we didn't necessarily understand in the beginning, right? We thought about the emotional effects of trauma, but we didn't think about the way it was changing our cellular structure, our DNA, and making us at much higher risk for a variety of additional adversities. So there's just sort of the image there, the famous one from the ACEs study. I did a little bit of a deep dive into some Utah specific data. So I wanted to just give you some of that. And again, you have the website and resources on the slides if you want to learn more about some of this information. But you know, how do you compare in Utah to the US? Interestingly, you're doing all right. Your rates of ACE, not all right, I should not say all right. Your rates of ACEs are lower than the national rate, right? So in Utah, you're at about 15.4%. Nationally is about 15.8% of people have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Our rates in Indiana are much worse. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But I think it's helpful to kind of know, right? And this website in particular, where I got this information, does some great drill downs by county, by area, by region. So you can get a sense of like what types of ACEs are people experiencing in different parts of the state and parts of your geographic areas. So this is going to talk about specific prevalence. So in Utah, about 63% of adults have experienced at least one ACE, and over 1 in 4 have experienced 3 or more. Women have higher rates than men in Utah at a statistically significant level, including particularly things like household substance abuse, mental illness, domestic violence, divorce, and emotional abuse. And then one more piece of this was just the breakdown by race and ethnicity in Utah. So adults here who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native are impacted with the highest numbers of ACEs at about 31.2%, having 4 or more ACEs, which is almost double the overall prevalence for other populations. Followed by people who are identified as multiracial at about 23% and Black at about 22%. So I just always like to look at population level data to put things in context for a conversation. So again, I encourage you to go back and look at some of that data particular to your region. So in addition to these adverse childhood experiences, of course, there are contextual pieces, right? And there are other things people are exposed to, like poverty, discrimination. We talked a bit about separation and divorce, transitions there, having to move around a lot, so frequent displacement, problems in school, traumatic grief and loss. Over 400,000 kids in the US lost a parent or caregiver during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen a lot of loss and grief, especially in the last few years. And then the experiences of those who are refugees or immigrants to this country have added contextual layers there. So, as I said, though, it's not just about the events and the type of trauma people experience, it's also about the impact. And so, when I am doing trauma work, trauma assessment at individual or organizational levels, yes, we want to know what those exposures are, which I talked about, acute, chronic, complex, but I also need to understand more about the impact on this particular individual. For some, it could have caused added stress, but it doesn't rise to the level of mental health symptoms or even a diagnosis. So, we need to understand sort of the differential impact based on what people have experienced. So let's zoom back out a bit, and I can tell you for nearly everybody who has experienced some type of adverse childhood experiences is the fact that it does derail development. So you saw that in building your brains, right? You saw these ways that, man, we were doing okay, and then we got this sort of toxic stress added to our plight in that particular year, and it kind of knocked us off for a while or made things weaker. So I think this image of the train is really helpful. It doesn't mean you can't get back on the path and that we can't have reparative experiences, but it does impact development, sort of regardless. And it can also cause regression of developmental stages that were previously mastered, right? Things I used to be able to do, milestones I met, I might see some regression there because of what has happened to somebody. So let's just talk about this at the brain level for another minute or two. Here's an example of that. Whoops, sorry. I'll wait till Adam gives me the green light.
Learning to deal with stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay. So you see that at the most, or at the earliest stages of brain development, some examples there of synapses and wiring and how that's impacted. So we see it play out at different developmental stages in different ways. So, right, you think about what's normally achieved developmentally, in the infant stage, in the preschool stage, and so on, and then how trauma impacts that. So I've used a couple examples here of just behaviorally how we might see that show up at different developmental stages. So I want you to sort of think about, I'm going to talk to you about this idea of relational poverty in just a second. But if you think about what is happening in the first year of a child's life, right? What are the kinds of milestones we want them to accomplish developmentally? What do we want babies to do? Talk, walk, eat, sleep. How could that not be first? We just want them to sleep, right? Sitting up, holding your head up. There's all these there's a lot happening in those first 12 months. And what are the ways, if you just sort of think about times you've been around an infant, what are the ways we encourage them to do those things? What do we sound like? High-pitched, animated, you can do it, come on, right? A lot of that. We are encouraging and demonstrating and encouraging and praising. That's, sort of verbally a lot of what infants ideally are hearing in those first few months, the first year of life. So I want to just give you an example of that. I'm actually going to show you a video in just a second of my youngest child's first steps, which we happen to catch on video. But I do want to warn you that they may be the most violent first steps in the history of man. So, but I want you to pay attention to, right? You're going to hear my squeaky, annoying voice encouraging him along with his two brothers. So let me know when I'm ready to switch. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to put up the... Seem to be talking about something that you cannot see. Go get it. Go get it. Okay, now back up, back up, back up. So he comes to you. Good job. Go, Jack. Go, go. Keep your arms out. Go get it, Jack, Jack. Yay! Yeah! Good boy. Oh. So that ended in a bloody nose for my oldest, no, for the baby, and then a loose tooth for my oldest, because everybody's fine, don't worry. But I'm always struck when I go back and watch that, right? And I think about this idea of how we're praising and cheering, right? We're doing all of that. What happens around month 12 as soon as they start being mobile and walking? Right. What changes in the way we speak to them? No, don't do that. Be careful. Stop. Don't. You're going to get hurt, right? It's this quick shift. And I just sort of think about, for a 12-month-old, the way we talk to them is one way. And then as soon as they become mobile, man, now we're afraid, right? And we start telling them everything they can't do and don't do that. And oh my gosh, and right? That's a pretty abrupt shift. And I think about a lot of the kids with adverse experiences like we've been talking about, how they have heard no, and you can't, and you're not good enough. And that actually doesn't stop, right? Throughout their lives. For many kids, ideally, all of that, don't stop, you can't do, it changes. We relax a little bit as adults. We recognize they need to go out and try things. But there are kids who continue to hear for many years this notion of the way we talk to our kids becomes their inner voice. And what they are hearing doesn't turn back to being positive and encouraging and back to that cheerleader. And so those are the kids I think we're talking about today. So it's this idea of relational poverty. And I want to tell you about one of Dr. Bruce Perry's studies related to this that blew me away the first time I saw these images and learned about this study. So they did a study where they followed kids around. They had observers and the child kind of rating their interactions all throughout the day. So this first figure is a 24-hour, what they called a relational contact map, that examines the number of positive relational interactions in a typical child born into a typical family. So all the ends, I think about those as like little dots at the end of each of those lines. That kid had lots of positive interactions, positive dots all throughout the day as rated by both an observer and the child. The darkest blue innermost circle is interactions the child had with family. The next circle is interactions with friends. The next is classmates and acquaintances. And outside the circles are interactions with strangers. So lots of these little doses of positive connectivity all throughout the day. The figure on the right is based on a 10-year-old boy in foster care who was moved in the middle of the school year to a new foster home away from extended family and community. This actually represents the best 24-hour map in a 2-week period. There were several days completely devoid of any positive relational interaction. So this kid had lots of interactions, but most were negative, right? Which can then be dysregulating, of course, all day long for a child. So the relational poverty, as Dr. Perry calls it, played a major role in this child's inability to progress. His symptoms related to trauma and neglect then persisted and increased while he was in these relationally impoverished settings. But once he was in a stable placement with positive relationships created like in school and in the community, he stabilized and improved. And so we need to think about leveraging what those positive dots are in people's lives. Because as Dr. Perry says, your history of connectedness is actually a better predictor of health than your history of adversity. There are things we can do to change the trajectory. And so, I just raise this as a challenge, and I'll use school as an example, right? What are our typical outcome metrics in schools, right? In our education system: graduation, test scores, retention, college readiness, ratios, all those things. But what if, to be provocative for a second, our sole metric of success was whether we increased the number of positive interactions kids have every day? Would things look different? So I just want us to kind of keep thinking about that and the ways that we might add to these positive dots. Because we know that the impact of trauma, of course, for many kids can lead to a lot of different diagnoses. So for example, I can tell you that a lot of the common diagnoses we use in my field of psychology actually have their roots in trauma. And we miss a lot of things because, for example, ADHD behaviors look very similar to a traumatized child who's dysregulated in school. It's actually quite difficult to tell the difference. But if we don't understand much about this child's background, we've put them on a completely different treatment trajectory without understanding what's really going on and what's going to be impactful. And so we know that many kids with these diagnoses you see on the right, like ADHD, oppositional defiant, and so on, actually have these developmental trauma, complex trauma histories. And the more we know about that, the better we can address it the right way. But instead, what we do often, of course, is say when kids go through these things, don't worry, they're resilient, right? So Dr. Perry reminds us that it's an ultimate irony that at the time when the human is most vulnerable to the effects of trauma during infancy and childhood, we tend to presume the most resilience. So I'm going to share in just a second another perspective on resilience, which I just appreciated the honesty here when Adam tells me I can. Experts all over the world. But this came up with Dr. Sandra Rothman, who has worked globally in a lot of natural disasters, when we asked her about resilience.
I hate the word resilience.
Say it.
I mean,
why?
No, because sometimes I don't like the way it's used. Like a child suffers, so you say, "Oh, don't worry, kids are resilient." It's like another way of like protecting us from the pain of seeing their pain. Like it's another way of not dealing with it or silencing the pain. And that's obviously not always true, but it's also like it has its whatever definitional issues, but I just don't want it misused, put it
Right,
that way.
like a crutch or an easy out because you just dismiss it. Right.
Like, don't worry, they're resilient. Don't worry, they're resilient.
That's exactly why we're doing this series, I think, because Julian and I were also frustrated with the assumption that the kids will just be fine. And so let's bring together all of these people to really talk about what makes them fine and the work we need to do to help them.
Just because kids are resilient doesn't mean that they don't suffer.
Right.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that they don't need our protection and our care.
It'd be so annoying, Adam, because I'm about to go to another video. Okay, so the key to resilience, we know from a lot of research, is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive and trusted adult. That doesn't always have to be a caregiver, and sometimes it's not possible for it to be a caregiver. So I'm going to come back to this idea again and again. That is often the magic solution, is like building that stable, caring, consistent relationship with a trusted adult. But we do see trauma impacts kids differently. So I want you to hear now from the man, the myth, the legend himself, Dr. Perry, in what he told us about why he thinks trauma affects people differently. And this comes out of the work we did in pandemic parenting in providing digital resources to parents throughout that time.
The major factor in adult, youth, or child getting over a traumatic experience or lots of traumatic experiences is the degree to which that person can get into safe, stable relationships. Different people carry this burden in different ways. And if you think about it as a burden, it really is important, because the more people you have around to give a little bit of the junk in your burden bag, the more they help carry it.
And it really does take the load off of people who've had trauma to have a caring relationship, where somebody is going to be understanding and nurturing and model healthy behaviors and all kinds of stuff.
Okay, so we see lots of variability in how people respond to trauma. And a lot of that has to do with these different factors, right? What was somebody's age or developmental stage when they were exposed to that traumatic or adverse experience? You know, were they a victim or a witness? Did it happen to somebody they know about or care about and love? You know, what happened? What's that domino effect after? Like, if you go back to that divorce example I used, did it mean that they had to move? They were displaced. They lost these connections in the community. It caused relational poverty for them. So a lot of the ways we see people respond depends on a lot of these different factors. And so we can't just say that, oh, everybody will be impacted by this type of trauma in this way. But something a mentor taught me years ago, Dr. Margaret Blaustein, whose work is also amazing, is this idea that people's behavior almost always makes sense, given an understanding of the context in which they develop. It makes sense. And she taught me this idea of getting curious, not furious. And gosh, do I use that with my kids a lot, right? And my coworkers, and, you know, of just, okay, let me just pause a second. Like, what is going on here? Let me get curious about what I'm seeing. So there's that iceberg image I mentioned earlier this morning, that often we are really only seeing the tip, the surface, and we don't have such context for what's underneath, or what the foundation was for that person. Because at the end of the day, our many years of study of human behavior is this notion that pretty much all human behavior comes down to one of two things. We demonstrate behaviors to fulfill a need or to avoid danger, keep ourselves safe. I challenge you to think of any human behavior that doesn't fit into either or both of those categories. And so when people have experienced ongoing trauma, they've generally had to deal with things like not having their basic needs met. And so what's underneath a lot of the behaviors we're seeing is that they're trying to get a need met, or they were not safe. They had a lot of danger in their life. So what they're doing is trying to keep themselves safe, even if it doesn't always make sense to us, right? On the outside, not knowing that early developmental context. So I want to share with you another framing by a colleague of ours down in South America, Dr. Sandra Baita, when, you know, we asked her to sort of talk through some of her experiences. And there's one part in particular I think is really related to a lot of your roles. So I'll let you hear from her now.
The most powerful message that we need to spread all around about childhood trauma is the understanding that these children's brains have been adapting to a word that was not supposed to be their word. During the time that they were facing their abuse, children didn't know we existed. They didn't know we were there for them, to treat them, to protect them, to make the danger end. So of course they needed to adapt to their environment. They didn't know, okay, by 12 o'clock, like Cinderella, this is going to change. So when they come to the normal world, when they come to the world without trauma, their brain is waiting for more trauma to happen. And what we see is the tip of the iceberg, the behavior, and we punish the behavior because we don't see the other part, which what is under the line of water. So the most powerful message is to understand that this that we have been labeling as misbehaviors have been adaptations to something that shouldn't have happened. And the child is now showing us with his behaviors, with his affect dysregulation, look, this is what I can show you about my previous work. If we just see the tip of the iceberg, we are not going to be helpful. That if we dare to take the signs, to just close our eyes and just try to imagine where these kids were coming from, we are going to be helpful. All of us, not only therapists, judges, prosecutors, teachers, parents, step-parents, adoptive parents. And this is the most powerful message that I think we can give when talking about childhood trauma.
So I love the line in there the most, that they didn't know that we existed. They didn't know that we were there for them, to treat them, to protect them, to make the danger end. And that's what I think about so many of your roles, is that you come into people's lives, into kids' lives, and they didn't know that you were out there, and you're out there to help them with these things. And it's just, it moves me every time I hear her say that, because it's so true that you are out there as these lifelines for these kids to be those stable, consistent, and caring adults. So I want to shift and just talk for a few minutes about what a trauma-informed community looks like. And this is one that's always stayed with me, right? When I see the 10 most wanted lists, I always have this thought: if we'd made them feel wanted earlier, they wouldn't be wanted now. So we talk a lot about this idea of a village, right? It takes a village to raise a child. And then I sort of think about what I hear from families I've worked with. People keep telling me it takes a village, but where is this village they're referring to? And then there's an African proverb that says, a child that is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. So how can we show up as a trauma-informed community? And I just want to point you to a few resources before I start to wrap up. So this is an excellent resource. It's by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN. The website's there, but it is a roadmap to me of how you build community resilience. So it's hard for you to read, but the puzzle pieces are all the different parts that go into our societal structures, our communities, right? Businesses, nonprofit organizations, healthcare, education, social services. And there are sections of this guide for each of these areas. Like, we don't always think about our business partners, right, in the community and how they can support some of these efforts, but there are a lot of ways. So, and what a trauma-informed community looks like at all levels. So some of the things that I kind of take away from this and other resources are, just what are ways like I can show up? Maybe I don't work in a social services agency. Maybe I'm just a community member, but I want to be part of the solution. I want to help. So these are just some ways to kind of think about doing that. There are a lot of ways you can show up. And one I want to emphasize in particular today, knowing we're short on time, is this idea of being easy to be around. It is hard to be a kid and interact with adults. It is especially hard as they get into adolescence and teen years. And so I saw this a number of years ago, this idea of like, what does it look like to be the easy to be around adult? So, I mean, I guess it's easier to think of the opposite, right? Like, who was that relative that you were like, oh my God, I do not want to go see Uncle so-and-so. Like, he's so whatever, fill in the blank, right? Or Aunt so-and-so would always just, I think we can all think of those grownups when we were kids that you sort of dreaded being around. What was it about them? Was it that they interrogated you, right? What are you going to do with your future? How's this going to go? How come you're not dating anybody? Like, all those questions we mean well and we ask to show interest are actually really difficult for a lot of kids, and they don't know how to respond. So what does it look like to be an easy to be around grown-up? Be that. Think about the grown-ups you liked being around when you were a kid. What was it about them? My guess is it's going to be things like they just really like listening. They seemed really interested in what I wanted to talk about or do. They liked spending time with me, right? It's not usually they bought me things or the things that we assume. It's just that you were easy to be around and you were there, present, consistent, caring, nurturing. So how can I be a more easy to be around adult is just one example of many you can get from a number of these resources. So I want to mention a couple of things about systems too, since we're talking at the sort of community and system level. So systems and organizations can also be traumatized, right? We saw that through the pandemic for sure. When there are policies in place or major changes implemented, a lot of times it's because something catastrophic or unexpected happened, right? When we see major changes in our organization, often there was a lawsuit or something really, a disaster happened. So we're not always proactive. We tend to be reactive to those things. But what can happen when we are not a traumatized system and we can think more creatively and be more proactive in our thinking? And I also want to mention the flip side there, which is that systems can traumatize. Okay, so this is an example. If you just Google like navigating the juvenile justice system, this is an image meant to help. But if you think about the families we work with, like, are your eyes glazed over? Like, oh, okay, what? And then I go, where and how do I access it? I mean, our systems and the way we set them up, they're hard for us to understand, much less really overburdened families and that are experiencing distress. And we're like, here's all these resources for you. Like, why aren't you taking advantage of them? Because our systems can be really traumatizing. And I often think of this meme when I talk about systems like this, right? So I saw this years ago. It says New York because we want you to know where you R and how to get where you're going, right? Nice organized grid. And then this is Boston because, right. And I lived in Boston for a lot of years, so I feel like I can relate to that. It reminds me of how we set up our systems, right? Do we want to be more like New York, or are we more like Boston, where we're like, well, figure it out. The stuff's there for you to take advantage of. You know, how have we gotten to this place in many of our systems where we've made it more like Boston and not like New York? So I want to just talk for a second about systemic interventions. I'm going to show you a clip from one of my favorite TEDx talks by a colleague of mine, Dr. Travis Heath. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, so the clip is going to come a little bit out of context. But he's going to give you an example of what I mean about a systemic intervention instead of just focusing on individuals. Oh, sorry, Adam, tell me when.
Frankly, it offends my soul when we think that we can pull someone out of a systemic problem, right, and blame them for that. So what I want to move towards is a more systemic model of care, right, and a less individualistic model of care. Okay. Now, as I was noting, this is sort of heavy. Maybe it has to be. But I want you to know that these ideas of locating distress inside the bodies of people, this impacts all the work I do. I'll give you another example, if I might. Share a story of a woman, a young mother who had given birth 4 or 5 months ago and was feeling very, very depressed. Okay? She said, look, all my family and friends say, take care of yourself. Self-care, right? We all heard that term before, self-care. And she goes, look, I'm trying to do it, but it's not helping. And then she drops her voice to a whisper, almost as if she's about to say something taboo, and she goes, look, sometimes it's actually making me feel worse. Her head drops in despair, and then she says, I can't even self-care right. Those words still reverberate through my being. I can't even self-care right. Now, look, I think self-care came from a good place. It came as a way to try to invite care into people's lives. I think that's a good thing. Moreover, what I don't think may be so good is if we believe that the distress exists in the self, then how do we heal the self? With self-care, right? How might we do this a little more systemically? Now, in March of earlier this year, there was a study released by the University of Colorado at Boulder. It was examining what's called the candidate gene hypothesis for depression. Basically, the candidate gene hypothesis for depression is a lot of big words to say that there's a gene that causes depression. For the last 20 years or so, that's sort of been the trajectory. We thought it was only a matter of time until we find this gene. So these researchers looked over studies that had tens of thousands, even some studies, hundreds of thousands of participants, and much to their surprise, they found no support for the candidate gene hypothesis for depression. None. They were more shocked than anyone. The thing about this is that idea that depression must be of us is so deeply rooted in the water supply that we don't even think to challenge it. Now, I'm not here to say there's no genetic influence to depression. That's a bridge too far. I think there's probably genetic influences, right? What I'm worried, though, is that we're looking so much at the genetic influences that we're ignoring perhaps more systemic influences. Okay? Now, if I could go back to the woman I was talking about who was feeling depressed after giving birth, so what did we do together? Well, I asked her a question. I said, hey, if you lived in a society where male partners, and this is a heteronormative example, excuse that, it's just she had a male partner. If you lived in a society where 50% of all child-rearing duties were taken up by men, do you think you'd feel more depressed or less depressed? That was her reaction, and she goes, oh, less depressed. And would it surprise you to know I've asked many women this question over the last decade plus, and unanimously they say less depressed. Now, you could say, well, those are her words, she's just saying that. Well, we put this to the test. We get a systemic intervention. We invite her male partner in to stand in support of her in these ways, and do you know what happens to the depression? It starts to go down. If this is something that's located solely in her, then why does a systemic intervention cause it to go down, right? What it seems like we're doing in this case and other cases like it, is we're asking a woman to self-care her way out of social inequity. That feels like a bad recipe to me, okay? Frank.
Okay, so what are some ways we can be more like New York? So thinking about the youth in front of you or the individual in front of you, a lot of this goes for adults too. This idea of shifting the way we think about people away from what's wrong with you and more toward what happened to you, right? Which is at the crux of a lot of these trauma-informed movements. What sort of need is this person trying to get met, or are they trying to keep themselves safe in some way? How do we increase people's dots, those positive relational interactions? How do we take away relational poverty? What are some systemic solutions we can talk about and move away from assuming these are all individual issues, right? Maybe there are some systemic pieces we need to think about to be a trauma responsive community. And then how can we show up? And I'm going to say more about showing up in just a second. Before I wrap up with one more video, I want to just orient you to a few resources, some of which I kind of shared, that are all out there, free, publicly available. The Roadmap to Resilience series I mentioned was that podcast series. There are infographics created from that. It's just roadmaptoresilience.org. These are all the different episodes. There are episodes specific for communities. What does a resilient community look like? And for probably a lot of the different professional areas you represent: law, mental health, and so on, education, communities. Pandemic parenting was the other one. We have all kinds of stuff on there about trauma-informed parenting, what that looks like, and just different resources, videos, infographics, and so on. It's a great one to recommend to families that are trying to find resources, science that's been translated for real people. Community resilience building resources, I've included a bunch of links for you there as you think again systemically in your organizations about how to do this. Digital resources, there are a ton of apps out there that I find to be really wonderful for showing people in the moment. Here's something you could do to help your kid emotionally regulate in that situation, or you as a grown-up. These are my two must-reads, both by Dr. Perry, surprise, surprise. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog changed the trajectory of my career out of just forensic and really to think about this trauma piece. It's amazing. And What Happened to You more recently came out and was co-authored with Oprah Winfrey and shares a lot about her experiences. It's really moving. And then a few of my favorite websites for you, organizations that have just great resources out there. So let's talk about showing up. Again, no matter what area you represent, you can be in somebody's life that's stable, consistent, caring, easy to be around, grown up. And so here's one of the most beautiful examples I've seen of that. When Adam tells me I can share it.
It's just hard with that. I mean, I was just a kid. I mean, because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and it was brutal. Oh my God, there's a school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate it.
It's a tough thing back here.
Yeah. This is crazy. There were some good times though, like we'd have a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open. And one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like supreme pizza. And another day, everything was fine. And another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we're sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry.
And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy, that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something, because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do.
Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
Yeah. There was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember, when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. He had this big old... just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When's the last time you saw him?
About 8 years ago. And actually, right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. It's gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but... I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up.
No,
I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew you all were doing something.
No, you did. There he is.
Yeah. I heard you were in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. I'm so proud of you. Done well. Done well.
So when I think about that, I think about how many people I get to interact with, right? Like college students. And I think about how you are who my college students are writing about in their papers, on mentors who changed their lives, who my clients over the years, you know, kids and adults, talked about in therapy as the ones who saw their potential when no one else did. So I guess I just want to say thank you for all the ways you work so hard in this community and in your spheres of influence to build these opportunities for regulation, empowerment, connection, and belonging for our youth. And I promise you, it matters a lot because I get to hear about it often on the back end. So I would just leave you with this notion of like, please keep showing up in whatever ways you can, because it is that connection, which is the secret sauce to resilience. And thank you for letting me talk with you today. And there's the QR code again if you want this.
Yes, get the QR code. And our next speaker can get ready while I'll kind of be the one in between just a little bit. Amanda, thank you so much. And there's hundreds of people online who have also been commenting, and you pretty much made us all need Kleenex at the end. There are probably a couple. You can come on over here by me.
I just didn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, you can come on over as we talk. So, you know, she touched on so many things and shared so many resources. Like, this is a wealth right here. We could all study all of this for the next year, I think, with what she's shared. And just remember that everyone who registered for this event, we will be sending out a follow-up email with all the links. There's maybe a question or two that we didn't have time for from the online, but Marcy has a record of those. And so you might even be able to answer a question or two, in the email that we send up to follow up. And this can be shared. We typically will have, so if there's 700 of us who are involved with it today, and when it's on the Davis County YouTube site, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of views after today. And that's something we love. Guess what brought that to happen? COVID. There are some silver linings of that terrible time. We had to figure out how to do a hybrid event. And that has actually made this more accessible to hundreds and hundreds and even thousands more people. You can go back and watch past years too. So look forward to that email and share it widely, please. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. As we plan for the next year, which we'll start doing next week, we always want to have someone who is a survivor and can share, not only the things that we have experienced sometimes in life and what we have thrown at us, but people who have overcome and who now teach and help others. And personally, I think that's a key to long-term recovery and healing, is to be able to help others. So I will introduce our next speaker. I don't even know if I've been the person speaking that you can't see. Our next speaker is Kevin Schaefer. So he was raised in Columbus, Ohio, the youngest of two children. He attended the Ohio State University, where he received his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD in sociology. That's kind of telling. After college, Kevin entered academia, first as a professor of sociology at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, Arkansas, then as a faculty member in the School of Social Work and the Department of Sociology at Brigham Young University. That is my undergraduate institution. Go Cougs. After more than 13 years in academia, where he studied family life and mental health, he moved into the private sector, where he has worked as a data scientist and evaluation researcher. Kevin has been married to his wife, Melissa, for more than 16 years, and they are the parents of 4 wonderful children, ranging in age from 15 to 8. They currently reside in Utah County. Please help us welcome Kevin Schaefer.
Thanks, everyone. And before I get started, I want to thank all of you for being here and everyone online who's also tuned in. And want to thank the sponsors of this event and for making it possible. I think it's a really important event, and I've learned a ton today. So thank you for that. So before we launch into this a little bit, I just want to give you a little bit of a content warning. I'm not going to go into details of my story, but it will be sort of a 30,000-foot view of my story. But I understand that these stories can sometimes be very difficult. And so if someone needs to stand up and leave the room or close their laptop or whatever it might be because of it, I totally understand. These things can be very challenging to talk about. So I am going to give you some personal background and tell you my story a little bit, and then we'll launch into everything I have planned. So I am going to show you a picture, and that is me at age 8. So it was Christmas time. I think it says Happy New Year in the background on the chalkboard, if you can't sort of tell. I think there's like 3 things to take away from this picture. One is I probably was born to be an academic / researcher. Not sure many 8-year-olds are rocking bow ties. So there's that. I think the second thing to sort of take away from it is I should have known exactly what I was going to look like when I was 43 years old. And the third thing to take away from it is I think the smile on my face in this picture, it looks very forced to me. And I'm sorry, I did not think this was going to happen. That video, like, primed the tear ducts today. So this was sort of at the end of the abusive episodes that I experienced. Between the ages of 6 and 8, I was sexually abused by a close family member. And when it happens, I think from a close family member, it feels almost more more of a betrayal than if it were just some random person, you know, that I went to church with or something like that. That's not to undermine or to minimize that at all, right? But I think sort of speaking to the idea of complex trauma, this is sort of what we're talking about, right? So between the ages of 6 and 8, I was sexually abused. I grew up in what I would argue is an abusive home, emotionally abusive home as well. And so there's a lot sort of going on in this picture, right? But in addition to that background, I was talking to a friend about this talk the other day, and I called it the two minds talk. And it's because I'm of two minds in all of this, right? I am a researcher by nature. Although I left academia, I currently work as a researcher for an organization that does behavioral health, mental health, and criminal justice research for state governments, for community organizations, et cetera, right? We do evaluation research for folks who are on the ground to understand how their programs work and how we can improve those programs to better the lives of individuals who have substance use disorders, mental health issues, traumatic histories, et cetera. And so, but I also have this personal experience, right? I have this deep personal experience. And so I think about trauma quite a bit. I also am of two minds on this talk for another reason. And the reason why I'm of two minds on this talk is I do not have this figured out, right? It's a pathway to healing. I don't use the word journey because I feel like Instagram influencers have somehow like co-opted the word journey in some way, and so I'll use pathway instead. And I don't know if any of the insights I will provide you from my personal life have. I feel like maybe they don't have that much value because I don't have it figured out. But I don't think anybody who has experienced trauma really does have it figured out, and that it continually influences and impacts your life throughout the entirety of your life. So this is the two minds talk. And I'm going to start with the academic mind, and I will eventually transition into the personal mind a little bit. So let me give you a little bit of research background, and we just heard a great talk about this research background as well. But let me add a little bit to that. I think because I think it's important to have context about abuse. I think it's important to have context around adverse childhood experiences when we talk about these things. So we saw this earlier, ACEs. I think the important thing that I want to take away from ACEs is the difficulty of experiencing multiple traumas simultaneously, right? And you know, I have some issues with the ACEs study and the ACEs measure, one of which is that it often treats these 10 things as if they're all equal. And they don't feel equal, right, in our minds. Like, divorce is horrible and it's hard and it can be very, very challenging for kids. It can also be very good sometimes, right? Like, I have a friend who once told me the day my parents separated was the best day of my life because it meant that the arguments would stop, right? But for many people, it's very, very difficult. But I think typically most of us would say divorce is probably not as traumatic as sexual abuse or neglect, right? But we sort of treat them all as if they're the same. But I think the reason why we treat them all as if they're the same is because we're thinking about the cumulative impact of ACEs on individuals, right? And so you can get an ACE score. My ACE score is 6. Okay, so I've experienced 6 out of the 10 ACEs on this list. It's not an exhaustive list, right? We can think of other adverse experiences that happen in childhood that can impact us, right? So it's 10 things, but we could probably expand this list out to 20, 25, 30, even more, and probably get a better picture of what childhood adversity and childhood trauma looks like. But I think the comorbidity of trauma is the thing that's important here, right? I think most people who experience 1 ACE, 2 ACE, they may be able to cope with those in healthy ways. But when we get to multiple traumas, that's where we see the issues and the problems that are associated with adverse childhood experiences on the lives of the individuals who experience them. So, we have these childhood adversities that happen to us in childhood, and they have serious long-term and short-term consequences, right? So as we think about in adolescence, we saw a list of some of these things, but we know that individuals with high ACE scores are more likely to use illegal and problematic substances. They're more likely to experience suicidality. They're more likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors, have poor mental health, have poor physical health, and do poorly in school. And then that has an impact on adulthood, right? Where we might experience chronic disease, substance abuse, obesity, risky sexual behaviors, again, mental illness, suicidality, emotional dysregulation, which can make this a cycle, right? We talk sometimes about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Those experiences can lead to a cycle from generation to generation within a family or within a community that can negatively impact the health and well-being of multiple generations of people, right? So 2 key statistics that I think are important to note. Adults with ACE scores of 4 or greater are 82% more likely to report that they have poor physical health than individuals who have ACE scores under 4. And the second thing, and maybe it's a little bit personal because my ACE score is 6, but adults with ACE scores of 6 die on average 20 years earlier than individuals who have ACE scores of 0, right? So your life expectancy in the United States is about 81 or so in the US. Imagine your life expectancy being 61, right? That's a big difference. That's a big difference. And the reason why that is, or why we think that is, and we sort of discussed it a little bit in the previous slide, is your body is literally your enemy in that case. We call it the weathering hypothesis, that you are being weathered from the inside because of the chronic stress that you feel, right? So you might be 43 years old, but your body thinks you're 63 years old. And so because of the constant fight that your body is putting up, right, against things that are happening. Sure, please do.
So I just see a lot of the times, like on social media, they say like the Gen Z generation is growing up faster than the millennial generation. And I think that's
I think you have a mic right there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I was just saying that I see a lot on social media that a lot of studies are saying that the millennial generation or the Gen Z generation is growing up faster than the millennial generation had to. So I just wanted to ask him, do you think this kind of correlates to that, or?
That's a good idea. I mean, I think it's a good thought. I think we live in an environment and a society currently where there are even more sources of potential trauma and potential for abuse than existed when I was growing up in the 1980s, right? You know, the constant bombardment of media, right, and sometimes very, very negative media can be problematic. I think, you know, this is something that has come up in Utah quite a bit, where the emphasis on the potential negative effects of social media and the potential public health risks associated with with social media, right? Like those weren't things that I grew up with, right? And so I think that's a huge factor that we also need to consider, right? There are more potential sources of where these things are coming from, including from anonymous folks, right? Folks who hide behind an avatar on Twitter or Instagram or whatever it might be, that won't even show their face to say what they're saying, right? I think that's a huge factor. Yeah, thank you. So just to emphasize this point a little bit more, the Centers for Disease Control have this data set that they collect every year. It has potentially the scariest name that you've ever heard of for a data set. It's called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which makes it sound incredibly nefarious, but it's actually really, really great data, right? The Centers for Disease Control call over 100,000 Americans every year in every state to understand the public health issues that are facing the US and how they might be different across locations, right? So the public health risks that we might face here in Utah might be very, very different from the public health risks that exist where I grew up in Ohio, right? And so they sort of consider that. But this comes from the Behavioral Risk Factors for Surveillance System, and they look at adverse childhood experiences every so often. So they asked the question, in the last 30 days, right, how many days would you say you've had poor mental health? And maybe this isn't the best measure of poor mental health that exists in the world, but it is one way to sort of characterize it. So individuals with 0 ACEs say they have 2 poor mental health days on average, right, in the last month. Individuals with ACE scores of 4 or higher are 3 times that amount, right, 6 times. So imagine losing a week of your month to poor mental health days, right? That's a lot of time when you sort of add it up, right? Also, when we think about poor physical health, right? Again, individuals with high adverse childhood experience scores say they have 6 poor physical health days a year compared to 4 for 0, 1, or the 2 or 3 ACE groups. So significant differences in how we experience health and how it impacts how we interact with the world around us as well. Okay, so this is where we transition from one mind to another mind. But it's a transition because my example is very academic, probably. Okay, so I want to talk about what growth is. And I think it's important to understand what growth is and what growth is not, right? Because, and I think I have personal experience with this. It sort of references what I said earlier, right? Whereas I sort of feel almost like an imposter talking about this issue. But what is growth? So let's imagine in a world where we just have data points, right? Let's do it monthly, right? I picked 12 data points here. So let's say over a year, I ask you once a month, you know, how satisfied are you with your life, right? And if we look at this is a scatter plot, right? I'm sorry for those of you who experienced trauma through your college statistics courses. I have to tell you that I taught college statistics courses for 13 years. So I'm sorry in advance. Okay. So I should have put a content warning around that too. Okay. So we have this scatter plot, right? And the dots look like, oh, they're sort of all over the place. Some are high, some are low, right? We have here on the x-axis time, right? So that's advancing sort of in a certain fashion. All right. Well, let's say we connected those dots. You get a graph that looks like this, right? You get highs, you get lows, they're up and down as time marches on. And I think that's probably how we think about this individually, right? How am I doing in the moment? Is often the question that we ask ourselves, right? Am I doing well? Am I doing poorly? Am I stressed? Am I tired? Yes. The answer is always yes to that question. But, I think this is how we often think about it. We don't think about the past typically in the ways that if we were to chart it in a different way, we might get a different answer, which is the linear regression line. Again, I'm so sorry, right? Because the linear regression line gives us the average of the data points, right? It's the best fit line for the 12 data points here that I made up, right? And here's what the linear regression line looks like. So even though we have all this noise moving up and down, what we're actually doing is we're moving in an upward trajectory, right? It may not feel like that to us as individuals, but individuals who are sort of outside ourselves, we often can see the growth in the people that we work with, in the people that we interact with on a daily basis, our family members, our friends, right? We can see that growth, right? And I think it's really, really important to tell people when they're growing, right? As my therapist will say, 6 months ago, a year ago, you would have never said that, right? You would have never agreed to that. You would have never felt that way, right? So it doesn't feel like that to me in the moment. When I go to therapy, I feel like I'm often in quicksand, right? Like I'm sinking and I can't get out, right? Like I'm just like, am I improving? Like I don't know, right? Like, so those reminders are critically important. Okay, so let's talk about the pathway, not the journey to healing. Okay, so I want to make a few caveats and a few statements here that I think are important. So number one is, I think people can take very different pathways to healing. But I do think that what I'm going to talk about connects well with what we just talked about in the previous presentation about the importance of human connection in order to heal from trauma. The second thing I want to talk about is, the second caveat I want to make is, I think it's also important for us to realize that childhood trauma or childhood adversity, we often talk about it as if it's destiny, right? Here's this thing that happened to you at 18, right? And then it's a variable. And then at 43, this is your outcome, right? So we go from A to C and we miss a lot of stuff that's happening with B, right? And how that could potentially moderate the impact of what we're seeing at age 43. The third thing I want to say is my experience is my experience, and it's not everyone's experience. I do not know what it's like to experience racism. I don't. I don't know what it's like to experience sexism. I don't know what it's like to experience homophobia. I don't know what it's like to grow up in an impoverished neighborhood. I don't know what it's like to live in a neighborhood with extreme violence, right? And I think that's really important to think about. And I want to piggyback on what we talked about earlier about the importance of systems and the importance of communities and those higher level things. I'm a sociologist, so that's how I think. I think about sort of systems and communities and those higher level sort of societal things. Those are critically important, and I want to echo and emphasize that. I also am going to use my bully pulpit for a second, right? And to say, I think the reason why we often put the burden of this on the individual is because that's a hell of a lot easier than fixing the systems that screw over the individuals. Like, that's easier, right? And when I taught in colleges and universities, I used to tell students this. I will literally vote for the first person who says, this is not a common sense solution. It's actually really complex. Let's think about the complexity, right? Because common sense solutions, if they worked, we would live in a utopia. But they don't, right? It's easier to blame the teacher for why a student isn't learning than it is to blame the educational system, right? Okay, so I'll get off the bully pulpit for a second. I might get back on, but okay. So the first thing I want to emphasize is the importance of professional help, right? And I think here I can sort of speak a little bit to an important gender difference that exists in access and a willingness to accept professional help. I have a friend who is a social work scholar at Boston College. His name's Scott Easton. He's done a lot of work around childhood trauma and childhood sexual abuse in men. And he has an interesting finding, and I think it's one that's really important to know. When a female experiences sexual abuse as a child, the average time it takes a female sexual abuse survivor to tell one person, right, what we call disclosure, is 6 months on average, right? That seems to be a finding that we see across the research literature. On average, it takes a man 25 years to admit it. That's a huge, huge, huge difference. All right? And it's because there's lots of reasons for it, but one of them is sort of how we socialize boys in this country, which is you don't need help, figure it out yourself, rub some dirt on it. Let's see, are there any other Midwestern euphemisms I can use? Those sorts of things, right? Buck up, yeah. Those sorts of things. And so it's often, I think, incredibly difficult for boys and men to admit to things that have happened to them. And I think that this is an issue that we need to take more seriously in the public health community. I think this is an issue that we need to take more seriously in the helping professions as well. But for me, professional help has been a real key to understanding trauma and the effects that it has had in my life, right? To understand that the reason why I might do X or Y or Z is not necessarily because I'm broken or because my brain doesn't work correctly or because I have some genetic predisposition to depression or anxiety or OCD or anything like that, right? The reason why is because when faced with a situation that reminds me of things that have happened in my life and in my past, my brain thinks like I'm 8 years old, not like I'm 43 years old. Right? My brain tells me that thing was awful and you're never going to let it happen to you ever again. Right? And so understanding that is critical and key, right? The other aspect of this is, look, we can treat the symptoms. We can't change the past. It's impossible, right? We can't change the past. It happened. But we can treat the symptoms and the issues that come from the past, right? Through medication, through professional help, through talk therapy, and through a number of other things that are emerging in the helping professions, right? We are, I think, sort of in a really interesting and important age to really think through the number of tools that exist in our toolkit and how they can help individuals who have experienced trauma and who've experienced childhood abuse and things of that nature, right? In ways that we haven't had before. And so that professional help is key. But it sometimes takes time to get to that professional help. And so let me tell you about getting to that professional help. Okay, so this is my family. It looks like we are holding at least 2 of these children hostage at Disneyland, of all places. What horrible and evil parents we are. But you know, these are my kids and my wife. And let me tell you about this. So My wife and I were married over 16 years ago, and we were living in Ohio at the time. And my wife is from out this way, and so we decided to get married here in Salt Lake City. And so we traveled out here to Salt Lake City to get married so that her grandparents and her giant LDS family, right, could all attend. and and so that was a great day. And then we went back to Ohio, where we had friends and family there as well, and decided to have a wedding reception. And we are on our way to the wedding reception. And I am slow rolling this thing like you can't possibly imagine, right? It is taking me 40 minutes to take a shower, 50 minutes to put on a suit, all of these things, right? Traffic is going to be bad, right? And I have now slow rolled this to the point where we are going to hit rush hour traffic and we are going in the wrong direction, right? So, and my wife goes, why are you doing this? Right? My wife grew up in New York. She has a way of being very direct. I appreciate it, actually. But why are you doing this? And I broke down. And she's like, what is wrong? You know, like this is supposed to be a happy day. Like we get to celebrate our marriage with our friends and family out here. And I said, my abuser is going to be there. And she goes, you're what? In retrospect, right? A guy in his mid 20s probably isn't thinking, I'm like, oh, everything's great. Doing well in graduate school, have some decent job prospects, life, great wife, starting out this new awesome chapter of my life. Everything's great. And it wasn't, right? If we went back to the graph, we were sort of at a high point, but we're at a high point, right? We're not sort of dealing with all the other issues. And so I tell her what happened to me, right? Before a wedding reception. Great timing, Kevin. Amazing. A+. And so great way 1 week into a marriage to go into things. But that was a hard day, right? And that was the first time that I had really admitted to anyone other than my parents what had happened. And I have to tell you that when I have told family members what happened, many of them don't believe me, right? And that is even somehow worse. That is worse than the abuse in some ways, you know? And it affects your behavior in all kinds of ways, right? When you are trying to get across a point, for example, about something and somebody disagrees with you, how do I take it sometimes? You're not listening and you're not hearing, so I'm going to say it louder, right? That is part of this. That's part of the challenge. At any rate, it also can be a powerful force in helping you overcome the worst effects of trauma. Dang it. That video, guys. Those 4 kids right there are my motivation. Right? As much as I sometimes hate going to therapy, they're my motivation to go to therapy. As much as I sometimes hate taking my medication, they're my therapy, or they're my reason to take that medication. I do not want them to experience what I experienced. I refuse to let it happen. And so they and my family, they can provide us with a motivation to get better. That doesn't make it perfect. That doesn't make it amazing, you know? Like when I used to teach sociology of family, I would tell my students on the first day, and you have to imagine this is at BYU, so it's sort of even more interesting. I would say families can do one of 2 things. They're either a great force for good or they're an absolute evil, right? They can do the worst things to you. They can do the best things to you. And sometimes I feel unsure in those relationships because of what happened, right? What's really going on behind the scenes kind of thing, kind of feeling. Let me talk about another powerful force for good. I have, as I mentioned, a fractured family of origin because of what happened when I was a kid. And sometimes those relationships go by the wayside because we disagree on something that's very fundamental. But let me tell you about the power of what I call chosen, or what's called sometimes chosen family, right? Our friendships matter a lot to us. The ability to trust others and to be vulnerable with others matters a lot. And having trusted people in your life that allow you to be vulnerable, to be honest, and to build a sense of trust it really matters a lot. It can be very, very difficult to do. So encouraging individuals who are in your care or that you are working with or whatever it might be to help develop those kinds of relationships are really powerful and important and useful. They have helped me tremendously, and probably we have very uneven relationships in many ways because they provide me far more than I probably ever provide them, and probably more than I could probably express or say to them. But those kinds of relationships with individuals do matter significantly for healing. And so developing those relationships, I think, is important. I think oftentimes individuals who have experienced abuse, they may want to withdraw from all kinds of relationships and interactions for fear of what might happen to them again, right? And that is not a powerful way to overcome the worst effects of trauma. It's an understandable rationale, but it's ultimately only going to make things worse, not better. And I want to talk a little bit about spirituality and faith. I think it's actually a very important thing, particularly here in a very religious state where we reside. I'm a Latter-day Saint myself, and the church put out this thing in May that they asked me to write about being a abuse survivor and how spirituality and faith could be a powerful force in helping someone heal. So let me tell you why my faith matters, and I don't think that it's. I think this is universal. So it's not exclusive to being LDS. It's also not, I don't think it requires organized religion to do it either, right? But let me tell you why this is important to me. So it gives me a sense of purpose. It shows me an alternative to how I was raised. It gives me a community. It gives me something bigger than myself. And as a Latter-day Saint, as someone who believes in the tenets of the faith, it also gives me a promise of eternal healing. The way I feel today is not going to be the way that I always feel. And so if you have clients or people that you are working with, for my social work days, right, the biopsychosocial spiritual model, let's draw on the strengths from all of those areas. Spirituality can be an important place where we can get things. At the same time, I want to also admit and be very, very honest and forthright that sometimes faith cannot be a powerful force for good, right? Imagine situations where a religious group covers up sexual abuse that's happened on their watch. We have dozens and dozens, hundreds, thousands of news stories about that, right? Spirituality may not be a particularly good place for healing as a result of that. And then, as many of you might be familiar in this room, in the LDS faith, family is important, right? It's critically important. It's a faith that teaches that you are saved with your family, right? And that those family relationships can go on for the eternities. I don't want to be in the eternities with some of the people in my family. I have zero desire right now, right? So sometimes, right, it can also be a challenge to our healing, and trying to negotiate those two things can also often be very, very difficult. So I think that's also an important thing to think about, an important thing to consider when we're working with individuals who have experiences with trauma, and how sometimes faith communities can sometimes contribute and often provide a lot of benefits to individuals who have experienced those things. Okay. Let me give you some concluding thoughts. I actually want to show you a quote from Madeline Popelka, who is an author in the Bay Area. Madeline is one of those individuals that has a, if they had like their name on the TV, and then they had on the TV news, and then they had like what their job is, right? They'd have like multiple like slashes and commas. They'd like one of those individuals. So author is what I'm going to go with, but like her CV is quite long. She said this, and I connect with it significantly. With PTSD, which I have been diagnosed with, I feel everything and I feel nothing. I'm both too much and not enough. When I want to isolate, I also crave connection. Things feel slow, yet happen all at once. This is also sort of connects with the two minds theme that I've been sort of tapping into today. This is a significant challenge of experiencing trauma and experiencing PTSD and other mental health challenges associated with trauma. I want to be around people. That matters a lot to me, but I also don't want to negatively impact those people in a way that I might have the capability to do, right? I remember, an example of this is, I remember when my first son was born, like vividly, right? It was 15 and a half years ago, and I vividly remember it. One thing I remember is when I first saw him, he gave me this look that was sort of like, I'm in charge now, and he was right. But the other part of it is, I thought I was so excited for fatherhood, right? Like couldn't wait to be a dad. And then I was a dad, and all of that fear rushed in. Am I capable of doing what happened to me? Am I going to potentially hurt my son? And I disconnected for months because of it. Disconnected from my wife, disconnected from my child, time that I'll never get back. But at the same time, right, I wanted to be connected to my son. I wanted to be connected to my wife. I wanted to be a really, really good dad. Like that mattered a lot to me, right? And I wasn't sure that I could be in that moment. But at the same time, I have hope, right? I have hope that things will get better, and they will continue to get better. I will say this. I do not know if I have the ability in my life, however much longer I have, to, quote, fully heal, right? But I do know that I can make positive progress, right? And I think the best metaphor I can think about for this is a little bit local. So if any of you have ever hiked Y Mountain, right, in Provo. It's the worst hike it's literally the worst hike in the world. I hate that hike. I'm also from Ohio, so I don't like hiking anyway. I'm like, I don't get the point. What are we gonna do? Like hike through flat corn fields? Like, whatever. But my kids love that hike. I do not know why. I cannot fathom it, right? There is no tree cover. It is like straight up on these horrible switchbacks, right? There's 13 of them, I think. 13 for a reason, I'm sure. But I'm surprised there's not 666. But at any rate, my kids love that hike. And I think about this like that hike, right? There's going to be switchbacks. It's going to feel very vertical at times. This path is not straight and it is not flat. But it's a path that you move forward on. So there's hope and there's challenges. And I think recognizing that both of those things can exist simultaneously is very, very important, right? I think oftentimes we don't want to admit to the challenges because that's hard and that's difficult. And I don't want to think about that. And I don't want to sit in that with you. But I think those challenges are things that we have to really think about, really consider, really work through, and that we work through them in a communal framework. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Well, right? Super powerful, Kevin. Just as you got started, everyone online was just saying so raw and so powerful. And it is important. Like, I think we have Supriya in the room, that like this is one of the most important things, is elevating the voices of survivors, especially of child sexual abuse, right? It is complex. And first time I thought about some things, like for all the different 10 traumas for each individual, and with everything in the environment or what supports, like all those different traumas will have different impacts on different people in different times, right? How interesting is that? And challenging too. Yeah, we've really benefited today from both of the speakers, and let's just give them another great round of applause. So, what a nice, beautiful day. Honestly, I kind of love days like this when it's just soft and beautiful outside. We didn't have to draw the blinds because there's no sun, so you can you can feel the moisture of the rain, which we don't always have here, and you can see the incredibly beautiful mountains. Make sure, Amanda, you just stand here for a while and breathe before you leave it. There have been clouds of birds swirling around. Sometimes you just see nature. It's absolutely one of my self-cares. And I grew up in southern Indiana, so it's mainly cornfields for most of my growing up. But every place has beauty if we'll take that in. So just the final things that, of course, you can watch it again. You can share this. So watch for the email that will come from Marcy Clark at the Health Department, and share it with everyone you know. Then we do this every year, and we do it here. And when we don't need the tables, we can actually fit more people in the room too. So this year was a little more limited in our in-person attendance, but usually we can have more. And remember your evaluation. Some of you are already doing that. Remember those. The basket is just right out this door. So be sure to put your evaluations in the basket. Please, we will use them as we plan for next year. We will share all the links and the resources. People were asking for slides of both speakers, so whatever you're comfortable sharing.